First, allow me to say how much I regret not being able to be there with you. I have many old friends who I was eager to see, and many others who I was hoping to meet and become new friends. I'm recording my remarks only because I'm scheduled to receive surgical treatment on my heart during this gathering. My intention here is to consider Father Matteo Ricci's legacy, that is, his lasting impact after his life in China, rather than to rehearse his actions during his life in China. Early Chinese writers, such as the Han Dynasty historian Bangu, insisted that it is only in retrospect that we can accurately judge a person of the past. Ban wrote that a good historian, quote, does not falsify what is good, nor does he conceal what is bad. 不虚美, 不隐恶. One hears much about the life of Matteo Ricci, and much of what one hears is hagiographical. Ricci himself was a model of Bangu's standard of truthfulness about the good and bad of what he discussed. And he would be the first person to exhort us to admit both his successes and failures as an intellectual and as a missionary. I first lived in Beijing during the 1990s, and since then I've visited Ricci's famous tomb many times. When Ricci lived in China during the late Ming Dynasty, he balanced his energies as a missionary with equal resolve to become more like the Chinese he met. He became more Chinese in his own habits and views in order to more effectively become a friend of China. After Ricci died in Beijing in 1610, a manuscript written by him in Italian was discovered among the papers he left behind. His confrere Nicolas Trigault brought these papers to Rome with him in 1614, published Ricci's narrative account of the mission in China in 1615 under the title De Christiana Expeditione apud Sinas, or On the Christian Mission in China. This work was the earliest history of the Catholic mission in China, and it reveals Ricci's keen commitment to bringing Christianity to China first and Western science second. He describes moving examples of Christian conversion in Shaozhou. Ricci commends the missionary efforts of his fellow Jesuit, Father Niccolo Langobardo, who baptized a large number of local Chinese. Ricci recorded that after the rites of baptism, confirmation, and First Holy Communion, the new Chinese Christians celebrated with almost displays that were more common of Chinese officials than religious converts. He wrote, quote, after returning to their homes, they were led out by the other converts to the sound of cymbals and trumpets. With the same display they are accustomed to make for a magistrate who had been promoted to a new dignity. During a period of 3 years, the Lord saw his harvest grow to 300 followers, a considerable number considering the difficulties encountered at the beginning, close quote. Following this account of how Chinese converts celebrated their reception into the church, Ricci described the circumstances of their conversions. He includes a long account of a 70-year-old man who, quote, counseled others of his own age and led them into the church, close quote. Here we see one of the earliest examples of Matteo Ricci's method of entrusting the work of spreading Christianity to local Chinese, rather than preserve this enterprise only for Western missionaries. It is important to remember that Ricci and his fellow Jesuits were not mainly interested in science, cartography, and secular philosophy, and that their religious aspirations were always their priority. Scholars know that Ricci published secular works while living in China. His 1607 collaboration to publish Euclid's Elements in Chinese is a good example of Ricci's exertions to expose Western science to China's learned class. In a 1609 letter to the Father General of the Society of Jesus, Claudio Acquaviva, Father Ricci wrote, quote, "There is a great hope in the abundant fruit that is to be gained from such a vast kingdom as China. For in this kingdom, learning and consequently all sciences and opinions founded on reason are held in high esteem. And that is why it will be easy to persuade the rulers of this kingdom with our holy faith through evidence provided by reason. And if they concede, it will be easy to convert everyone else," close quote. Now, Ricci overconfidently expected that converting China to Catholicism would be, quote, "easy." But he astutely observed that science and reason would serve as effective methods of friendship and cultural bridges in the Ming Empire. Ricci may have published scientific works, produced the world map, and mastered the Confucian classics. But supporting all of these endeavors was an abiding conviction that all he did was intended to lead others to God. Now, here I should add that both Ricci's secular and religious efforts were always connected to a sense that friendship must be cherished, whether or not one's friend is a Christian. For Matteo Ricci, both conversion and community are essential, even if community is the only result of his life as a missionary in China. There is much evidence of Ricci's custom of collaboration with Chinese friends. This evidence appears in the preface of his Chinese translation of Euclid's Elements, published in Beijing under the title Ji He Yuanban. In the preface, we read an interesting assertion. The work is described as Li Ma Dou Kou Yi Xu Guangqi Bi Shou, or, quote, orally dictated by Matteo Ricci and written down by Xu Guangqi. Now, I envision Father Ricci and his friend Xu Guangqi sitting together, drinking warm tea, collaborating on a book that is now among the most celebrated Chinese translations of Western science from the Ming and Qing dynasties. This represents only one of many collaborations between Western and Chinese intellectuals during China's missionary era that resulted in the long Sino-Western exchange of technical and religious knowledge. Among the most lasting legacies that Ricci left in China was what scholars commonly refer to as, quote, indigenization, or what I prefer to call localization. Now, I personally prefer the term localization because the idea of indigenization of the Chinese church has been largely driven by non-Chinese. And I, for one, find it problematic when non-Chinese ecclesiastics promote their own ideas of what a, quote, Chinese church should look like without better allowing the Chinese themselves to form such a vision. Chinese Catholics have always insisted that creating their own localized church with its own Chinese hierarchy of bishops is paramount. Chinese bishops are best equipped to be the pastors of Chinese Christians. The Chinese Catholics I know have never desired a Chinese hierarchy independent of the Holy See, but rather one that, like all other local churches, is overseen by the people of their own culture. The first Chinese bishop, Gregory Luowanzao, was consecrated in 1685, and no other Chinese priest was made a bishop until 1926, when Pope Pius XI consecrated 6 priests to the episcopate in St. Peter's Basilica. It took 241 years until native Chinese were allowed to govern their own church. When writing of the 1926 ordination of 6 Chinese bishops, the Jesuit scholar of Matteo Ricci, Father Pasquale Delia, asserted that, quote, a mission is a transitory step. What is permanent is the church. The mission, therefore, has to give up its place to the permanent church, close quote. In other words, by the early 20th century, the era of Western authority over China's church was finally giving way. One sees the seeds of this movement in the life and works of Matteo Ricci. By the 19th century and early 20th centuries, the popular imagination of Matteo Ricci in China was infused with the aesthetic and hagiographical sensibilities of Baroque Rome. The missionaries of the late Qing dynasty sought to emulate Ricci's example of localization, as if they were themselves, quote, little Riccis. Jesuits and members of other orders and congregations commonly posed for formal portraits with an image of Matteo Ricci and Xu Guangqi in the background. A portrait of Saint Léon Ignace Mangin, taken during the 1890s, is a good example of how missionaries both had Ricci's image behind them and also how they dressed in Chinese clothing to emulate Ricci's appearance as a Chinese literatus rather than a Western priest in a black cassock. In addition to the aesthetic emulation of Ricci's example of, quote, being Chinese while living in China, close quote, Jesuits also wrote and staged plays in China to celebrate the witness of Chinese Catholics. Written by European Jesuits, forged in the kilns of garish Baroque sets in the vein of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, these plays were at once impassioned productions that seemed more Western than Chinese. But aesthetically, they were nearly indistinguishable from the stage performances one would have seen in traditional opera halls. In the aftermath of the Boxer Uprising, Jesuits collected the testimonies of first-hand observers who had lived through the conflicts of 1900. And based on those accounts, the French Jesuit Pierre Xavier Merton wrote and directed a Chinese play commemorating the massacre of 2 French Jesuits and several Chinese Christians, well, 2,000 or more, Chinese Christians at the Catholic village of Zhujiahe, entitled Zhujiahe Zhimingju, or Drama of the Martyrs of Zhujiahe. Saint Mangin, seen in this image, was one of those who perished in that attack. On Thursday, 1st of May, 1930, a crowd of spectators assembled in a massive courtyard in front of a temporary stage erected at the Jesuit school at Kaizhou village. The dramatic character of the performance was decidedly Baroque and decidedly inspired by Father Ricci's example of enculturation. The actors who were drawn from the school wore Chinese garb so that Ricci's legacy of localization could be emphasized. The costumes were a mixture of the robes and insignia of imperial officials and makeshift sartorial representations of local literati and Chinese Catholics. The characters depicting the massacred Christians are seen in the photographs wearing white and holding palm branches. Matteo Ricci's example of friendship and dialogue was, as Father Merton intended, underscored in his Chinese play about Chinese martyrs who had died on Chinese soil. Ricci's legacy of cultural dialogue had by the 19th century wedded Baroque content with Chinese stagecraft. I should also note that I should also add that Merton did not write his Chinese plays alone. He did so with other Chinese collaborators, similar to how Matteo Ricci wrote the Jihe Yuanban with Xu Guangqi. Among the most adamant followers of Ricci's method of localization were Father Vincent Leb and the first papal diplomat to China, Archbishop Celso Costantini. Costantini, despite opposition from several of his fellow bishops in China, all of them European, convened in Shanghai what he called the Primum Concilium Sinesi, or the First Plenary Council for China. Convened in Shanghai held at the very famous Jesuit church named after Saint Ignatius of Loyola. China's bishops gathered there to discuss how to follow Matteo Ricci's example and localize the Chinese church in areas from theology and liturgy to art and architecture. As the bishops formally processed from the church, it became evident that another topic must be confronted. The overwhelming majority of non-Chinese leaders who governed China's Catholics. Now, in a short film shot at the Shanghai Council, quite a rare film, we see just how visibly Western bishops overshadowed the Chinese in their own nation. Under Father Ricci's example of local empowerment, Costantini and his fellow European bishops sought to end the dominance of Western prelates in China. Let's see if we can get this clip to work. And here we see a rare film of Archbishop Costantini while he's in China at the 1926 synod. Under Costantini's direction, a new wave of what we might call Sinicized Catholic art and architecture began to punctuate China's vast religious landscape. Print and carved images of Our Lady of China became more widely produced. Churches began to adopt Chinese aesthetic sensibilities, and liturgical vestments and vessels were made in Chinese designs and with Chinese materials. Now, as I reach the conclusion of my remarks, I should note a few final thoughts. A very large number of Jesuit missionaries followed in the footsteps of Matteo Ricci, inspired by the stories of his life in China, told and retold in Jesuit houses throughout the world. Among the remarkable materials held in the Society of Jesus Archive in Rome is a collection of letters written by Jesuits called Litterae Indipete to the generals asking to be sent abroad to mission territories. Now, in one part of the archive, there are 29 boxes containing 14,067 letters by about 6,167 Jesuits. And perhaps as many as 2,000 additional letters are held in other parts of the archive. These letters were written before the suppression of the society in 1773, and a very large portion of these requests asked to be sent to China to continue the work of the great Matteo Ricci. Countless Chinese encountered the gospel and became Christians under the influence of Jesuit missionaries who went to China because of the witness and legacy of Father Ricci. And it is important to bear in mind that it was Ricci himself who admitted the first two Chinese men into the Society of Jesus on 1st January 1591, Zhong Mingren and Huang Mingsha. It is accurate to say that the society in China was born under the influence, largely, of Matteo Ricci, and that the Jesuit mission after his death was encouraged by his example. So powerful was the Jesuit desire to go to China that, as Father Edward Malatesta has pointed out, droves of young Jesuits set out for China, despite the fact that, as Father Malatesta put it, quote, only 1/3 reached their destination due to sickness and disaster. I'll finish my remarks here about the long and gilded legacy of Father Matteo Ricci. Over the course of my many years in China, I have witnessed effusive admiration, the effusive admiration that Chinese Catholics have for this Jesuit from Macerata. Both members of the Communist Party and worshippers in China's churches agree that Ricci's legacy is one of cultural friendship and dialogue, but especially from the point of view of China's Catholic faithful, Matteo Ricci represents the witness of the Christian gospel and the holiness of a saint. I've heard this so often in China. Ricci is a shengren, a saint. Cries from the academic community call for Ricci's recognition as an apostle of the mind, and cries from the Catholic community call for santo subito, or sainthood now. Near the conclusion of Ricci's most famous classic, his Tianzhu Shiyi, the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven, Ricci wrote that, quote, to teach others about the events of the past and present, one need not be a saint. But I suggest that the legacy of what Father Ricci taught in the past and his influences on the present reveal him to be precisely that, a saint, who taught the church how to more effectively transform the Christian faith from one that is merely enculturated into one that is integrated with the fabric and the fabric of the culture that is already there. I'll end here. Thank you. And I ask for your prayers as I enter into my medical treatments. Thank you so much.